Hey there, and welcome to Checkbox Other, the podcast for those that don't fit in a defined box or category. I am your host, Nikki Innocent, and I am so excited that you're here. Again, like I said last episode, if you are new, welcome, hello. And if you've been here before, welcome back. I am so grateful for your time and your ears and your energy in these much needed conversations. And I am beyond excited for today's guest. Today's guest is Sarah Beaulieu, the founder of The Uncomfortable Conversation and an incredible advocate and activist working towards a society where we have a more normalized conversation around sexual assault, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. The Uncomfortable Conversation is a wonderful organization she has created to allow for more conversation around the dynamics that create the society where we don't necessarily know how to talk about sex and our sexual exploration, and when sexual assault and when sexual harassment and sexual violence happen, that we are at a loss for how to handle and talk about and address that situation. How to hold people accountable appropriately, how to welcome and encourage conversation ahead of time to set the stage for a much more respectful, considerate, consensual dynamic that's not just one yes or no for everyone involved. Sarah's coming out with a new book all around the Me Too movement and navigating the Me Too movement in the workplace. It's called Breaking the Silence Habit. And I am just so excited for Sarah to share more of her story with you. I'm always blown away, but I guess at this point I shouldn't be, by how the universe puts the timing of the conversation in the larger national and global discourse so on track with the release of these podcast episodes. So Sarah and I did this recording a few weeks ago, maybe even a month ago. And in the last week or so, there has been so much conversation about the Me Too movement, about Christine Blasey Ford's Senate testimony, but also her experience overall with the sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, sexual violence that she experienced at the hands of one of our Supreme Court justices. It makes me cringe even saying that out loud. There is a new New York Times article that came out that details more information about that said Supreme Court justice and his behavior. And alongside with that, we have a book coming out called She Said. And I am so eager to hear more from that book, to dive deeper into the New York Times article, to really just allow for this space of hopefully productive conversation, discourse, and a space for accountability to be placed where it should, and for responsibility to be taken across the board. Unfortunately, I think we've witnessed as a country some difficult exchanges and difficult outcomes from bringing this conversation around Me Too and sexual assault, sexual violence to the forefront. And in, I guess, true fashion, a lot of times our society has been built on some pillars of misogyny, but really pillars of power as well. And when those two mix, how something that can be such a traumatic and difficult experience as having a sexual assault or harassment or violent exchange in your life or in the life of someone that you care about happen, and then you watch people kind of joke it off or act like it never happened or speak ill of the experience. They don't believe other people. They don't believe the victim. There's victim blaming and shaming. There's all these dynamics that are oddly just so familiar to our society at this point. If you watch TV, these things happen all the time. There is a new series on Netflix called Unbelievable that chronicles the dynamics of how difficult it can be to report an experience of sexual assault, and how the system behaves, and how those around you behave, and how you as an individual, if you are making the courageous effort to speak out about something horrible and tragic that happened to you, how difficult that experience can be. So again, we talked about a couple of things. We talked about Christine Blasey Ford, the New York Times article coming out. We also had an incredibly generous and courageous experience on a larger scale with Chanel Miller coming forward and putting a face and a name to an experience that, as a country, I believe we were shook. I hope we were shook to our core a bit about. And this is with the Stanford sexual assault case. Chanel Miller is known as Emily Doe through most of the experience. Again, we were given the name of the aggressor, who then somehow became a victim in his own right in the sentencing around this case, that, he had a life to live and we shouldn't hold him accountable for his actions. But I am so grateful for Chanel Miller being so brave and open and willing and strong, honestly, to stand there and say, this is who I am. I am not Emily Doe. I am Chanel Miller. Here is my story. And really, her hashtag Know My Name is really important. I feel like we talk a lot about the people and dynamics that hold the power. And again, sexual assault, sexual violence, sexual harassment, power is the common denominator around most of these experiences, if not all. That we are taught that sex is something we don't talk about. Sex is a hush-hush thing that we're not allowed to understand and explore and have a conversation around it. But sex is used for so much power over. And so to have a face and a name and somebody to really humanize a person in this story that has been dehumanized and hasn't even been really given a name and has been kind of not even acknowledged fully on a larger scale, to have her come forward and be willing to say, this is who I am, and hashtag Know My Name is just something that is, I don't know, it fills me with, I've got chills, I've got a little bit of heat going through my body, because it is such a powerful thing to witness. So, as I mentioned, this is going to be quite an episode. Sarah is incredible in her story and her work, and in the way she tackles this conversation that, again, is uncomfortable. I say it with a smile because, again, I mentioned she is the founder of The Uncomfortable Conversation. And she also, the thing that I do want to make sure I mention is she goes into organizations and works with them on setting policies around sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. But she also goes in and helps organizations when an altercation and an incident has happened and they're not really exactly sure how to handle it. And so having her on the podcast to talk about her thoughts and her path forward and the incredible insights that helped create this wonderful book that will be coming out early next year is just such a treat, and I am so grateful for her time. If you have any thoughts around this episode, please do head on over to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast. Click on the link called Join the Conversation in the middle of the page, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and insights around this particular episode. If that's too many clicks and that's too many keystrokes to type in the URL, I get it. Feel free to drop a comment on the podcast post that I will have on social media at Nikki Innocent. Again, this is an uncomfortable conversation, but it's one worth having. And if any of you are feeling as though this might be a little too difficult today, if you are a survivor of sexual assault, if you're working through an experience yourself and this feels a little bit too close to home, trust me, I understand. We are in this space where this stuff comes at you from left, right, and center, in the news, in the media, in conversations at work, from the mouth of our president. And so if this feels like it's too much, please do give yourself the self-love and compassion to skip this. I do think that it's a worthwhile conversation to be listening to, but if you're not able to do it right now, that's perfectly fine. And I welcome you to take care of yourself and give yourself that love and support that you need right now. This is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing journey, both as individuals and as a larger society. And I do respect where everybody is in this journey. So, okay, now without further ado, here is my wonderful conversation, the uncomfortable conversation, but truly an educational and transformative conversation with Sarah Beaulieu. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Nikki.
Welcome to Checkbox Other. I'm so happy you're here.
I'm so excited to talk with you.
Oh, yes. I feel like it's been so long since we've had the opportunity to connect live, but it's amazing what social media and online media will do for me to feel like I've been in conversation with you, even though I haven't seen you.
Same. I feel like I have been along for the ride with your journey.
Yes. Oh, well, I already said this to you before we started recording that I got chills, but I got them again. So anyway, so I am so excited for you to take a minute and just walk us through your journey, some of the aha moments, some of the pivots that you've made that have led you to where you are today.
My personal and professional mission is really grounded in conversations about sexual violence. And so I always like to start the way that I sort of start my journey on this with the first conversation that I had about sexual violence. And that conversation took place when I was 11. And it was the night that I told my mom that a family member was sexually abusing me. And so we were visiting a relative's home and something happened. It wasn't the first or the last time that something happened to me. It wasn't the first time that I was sexually abused. It wasn't the last time I was sexually assaulted, but it was the first out loud conversation that I remember having about it. And, and here we are. This is now almost exactly 30 years later. And I remember that conversation so clearly. And it was, my mom did something really powerful in that moment. And it was that she believed me. But then she left the room and I heard voices arguing. We kind of ate breakfast. There was a confrontation with the abuser. We stayed the rest of our visit. It was like this horrible kind of discomfort that I remember feeling. But it was a time that I learned about the power of conversations. And I learned that a single conversation can change the trajectory of our lives. I learned that conversations about sexual violence make your stomach hurt because of how uncomfortable they are. And I learned that a single conversation was not going to be something that could permanently undo generational habits of silence. And that to do that requires just ongoing attention.
Wow. Yeah. That's beautifully said. My goodness. Yeah.
So what my mom did, by believing me in that moment is that she kind of helped lay the groundwork for what would be my pathway back to myself and a pathway to healing. And so it didn't immediately undo, obviously, the damage of being sexually abused. And I struggled with many of the things that people who experience sexual abuse struggle with. So I struggled with depression. I struggled with self-hatred, with an eating disorder. But it was, kind of conversation by conversation that my personal healing journey started to unfold. So I was lucky enough to find a therapist who asked the right questions, who really believed in my capacity to heal and become a whole person. It was my best friend in college who was a man, and he was a man of color. So we sort of saw the world in many, many different ways, but came together around the kinds of conversations that we needed to have in order for me to feel safe and safe in the world again. And so I always start my professional journey with that personal experience, but I also like to be really clear that my personal experience as a survivor doesn't make me an expert, but my personal experience, as well as the gratitude that I have for the privilege of being able to access the help and healing that I needed, is what sparked a passion for me to help to create pathways for other survivors, for the people who want to help them but don't know how, and increasingly for communities, workplaces, cultures, and organizations who want to imagine a world where we can all be safe and respectful together. And so so I think it was my passion for inspiring and having these conversations, really just, it's always been grounded in this like obsessive optimism about the world and about our capacity to do things differently and to heal and to heal together. And so, so kind of like with that, like I went on, I had a degree in women's studies. I was a rape crisis counselor. I worked with and alongside survivors of sexual violence. I also started doing advocacy work pretty early and did things like bringing fraternities and campus feminist groups together in ways that were productive and meaningful to move forward after a campus sexual assault took place, like as just one example. And so,
wow. That must have been an interesting room.
It was, yes. I mean, it was a very interesting room. It was like everybody started out very upset, and we're not hearing each other, right? So the incident that happened was there was a sexual assault that took place. It was a guest at a fraternity party, and I was a women's peer counselor. And so my women's peer counselor friends were very upset. We were trying to help somebody who had experienced something very traumatic and her friends get through this experience. At the same time, I knew people in the fraternity, and they were also equally horrified that this had happened in their fraternity and wanted to do something about it. But everybody got into this very defensive stance. And so essentially we went from organizing what was supposed to be a rally outside of the fraternity to a candlelight vigil that was attended by everybody. somebody and presented in a really respectful way, which was more of a moment of healing than it was a moment of confrontation, which was like not what anybody wanted or needed at that particular moment.
But again, everyone's conditioned to armor up, right? Like something difficult's coming and I'm going to be put in a category of something maybe I'm not necessarily responsible for or accountable to, but I also know it's wrong and I don't have the words. I haven't had the conversation, I haven't had the experience. All I have is what you mentioned before, that stomach, that stomach feeling, that clenching, that and you don't want to make it worse, but you also don't want to sweep it under the rug.
Exactly. And in those moments, it's like those are the moments where people need the most empathy and grace. And also what I've learned, particularly with those with the least experience, that some people are very practically minded about that. Like they just need some practical advice and guidance on what do I say in that moment? What's the right thing to say? What's the wrong thing to say? And in most cases, it's not, there's no, what's the magical thing to say? Something I hear a lot from men of like, what's the magical thing that I could say to somebody who's hurting to make them stop hurting? Like, and that's such a beautiful, I mean, it's such a beautiful thing to want that for somebody that you care about. And yet at the same time, not possible. And so it's like helping people understand that is what I'm really passionate about.
That's amazing. And so, okay, so I'm just imagining like college age you being like, I can hold this space and have these conversations. It's just amazing. So, okay. In college, you had experience of bringing people together over very, highly contentious emotional issues. And at the same time, there are people seeking practical solutions. And, I thought as you were saying that kind of easy button, and not easy button in a lazy way, but like, can you give me the answer to 1 + 1 = 2? And you're like, it's not a math problem. So how did that evolve post, at least that experience, post college, however you'd like to go?
Well, I mean, so I think what happened for me is that college was this very intense time of healing and relationships and finding myself in myself and finding a way to have trusting relationships with other people. And so when I graduated and I got my first job, the first job that I got was in fundraising. And so, which, again, kind of looking back, I see how a career in fundraising helped me learn how to facilitate conversations across different kinds of individuals and groups. So I was a fundraiser, I was a strategist, I was a consultant, but I was also suddenly, without meaning to, went into the closet as a survivor of sexual violence. And so it was actually probably about 10 or 12 years into my professional life that I had my son, who's now almost 8, and we were thinking about having a second child. And I woke up one morning and just realized that I had this brand new professional network. I was working for this national organization that was doing bipartisan policy work, which I think was also informing the way that I was thinking about coming to issues in a way that would encourage conversation and action, and the way that you would need to frame them in order to do that effectively. So I was kind of immersed in cross-sector bipartisan work. And I realized that no one in my professional network had any idea that I was personally a survivor of sexual violence. And even more surprisingly, that here I was working with some of the folks sort of at the top of their game in philanthropy and supporting youth and running youth-facing nonprofits, and that nobody was talking about sexual abuse or assault. And I knew the statistics, right? So sort of like as somebody who cared about this issue, I knew that in the US, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men had personally experienced sexual abuse or assault in their lifetime. How is this not a conversation that we're having? Why are people not talking about it? And I had some assumptions that later turned out to be wrong about why that was. But that was kind of what sparked my interest in this work. And so I basically decided that, well, what would happen if I just started talking to people about this? And so that was back in about 2012. So it was about 6 or 7 years ago.
And I'm really curious if you're willing to share what, if there's maybe 1 or 2 of those assumptions that you held. As you were saying, I stepped into my professional life and I was in this place of really trying to facilitate conversation, and somehow this core part of my experience that has shaped a lot of how I think about how we converse and understand and empathize with one another has kind of gotten lost in the mix, and that this space isn't welcoming of that type of vulnerability and conversation. What kind of assumptions did you have then, and how have those shifted?
So there are a couple of categories. So one is I grossly underestimated So I was learning about the nonprofit sector, right? And I was
Yeah.
learning, and we were doing work around education and around economic opportunity. And the field of organizations that support those issues were very, frankly, like very well funded and very sophisticated organizations. And I had joined the board of the Rape Crisis Center here in Boston, which was a 40-year-old organization and was just hiring its first communications manager.
Wow.
After 40 years. And so when you think about the degree to which it is possible for a field to get the message out about an issue. So it's like, so one is there's no amplification in the field. So there's no field voice that is really powerful enough to create the conversation, because they're literally just responding to crisis and doing the face-to-face, really critically important direct service work with survivors that was primarily funded publicly. So that was number one. Number two is that when I was out there learning about the kind of content that was available and talking to people, there was a great amount of content that was available through a more of like a counseling lens for people who had experienced sexual abuse or assault.
Right.
There was some work that was primarily targeted at men, designed to prevent them from being rapists, frankly, which helpful, right? But was also like lowest common denominator in terms of audience.
Right. Once you're at that point, right? Yeah.
And then there wasn't a lot of content that was out there for men. And so one of the things that I really believed about men at the time, which was that they didn't want to talk about sexual violence because they didn't want to get labeled a rapist, and that it was from like a defensive posture. So it's like, well, I don't want to be told that I'm like bad or wrong, so therefore I don't want to have a conversation. And what I found through, I had probably several hundred conversations. I did over 50 interviews with men from all different ages and backgrounds. I met with a bunch of different leaders from different sectors and would ask them these same kinds of very personal questions about, like, tell me about the first time you talked about sexual violence. What was the conversation like? Have you encountered survivors who identify as female? Have you encountered survivors who do not identify as female, who identify as male or transgender? What were those, sort of, how did you show up for them? What about in your intimate? Like, I would ask all of these questions. And then once you got, but then what I found is that once you got men talking about this, is that it actually wasn't defensiveness, it was helplessness. Right. And it was this desire to, what we teach men, and again, it's like I struggle with how to sort of talk about gender in a non-binary way. So like when I talk about gender in a binary way, it is to reflect the fact that that's how we culturally think about it, not because I think we should think about it that way. So I just want to put that up. And I am, in fact, talking about cisgender men in this case. But it's like what we teach men is we teach them to fight, flight, or fix. And those are not always the right kinds of reactions to have, especially in face of an issue that's so pervasive and so helpless. And I also found many cases where there were men who had personally experienced sexual abuse or assault and literally had nobody that they talked about it. And as I learned, and studied more about male survivors, I think it was really understanding the pain that they feel, and particularly the pain that they feel when an issue like sexual violence tends to be talked about publicly as a women's issue. And I'm like, it's just not.
Right.
And how painful and how isolating that must feel to them. And explains why the average age for men to come forward to seek help is in their 50s.
Wow, in their 50s. I did not know that.
50s. I mean, there's just so much lost potential and lost relationships and lost fatherhood and lost brotherhood and it's like, you just think about the loss that we have,
right?
Because we're unable to help people heal.
Right. And we're unable to accept. I think, the interesting thing that you were talking about is this binary. And I've been doing a lot of thinking around masculinity and femininity, and not male and female. And that we all have a mixture of masculinity and femininity within us. And again, our society talks about masculinity in this fix, right? And maybe this fight, flight, and fix that you mentioned. But, that I want a practical answer of how I can solve, because as a masculine, to be a man, right? I'm expected to fix things. So can you just give me the manual for how to fix this?
Right.
Like, that is something that is so conditioned from a very young age that
Yes.
we internalize as our own personality
Right.
traits and our own choices, where like it was generationally there before we got
Yep.
there. And then, people are making choices of the colors and the clothes we wear and the toys we get to play with and what
Right.
we're interested in before we even know there are other things to be interested in.
Right.
And so this idea is so interesting of it being a women's issue, which,
Yep.
let's not lie. I mean, you just talked the numbers, 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. So if we're going to go numbers, right? 1 + 1 = 2. If that's where you're comfortable. Okay. From a statistics perspective, there are more women experiencing this. And if we're making assumptions there, which I'm assuming we're not, you probably know the numbers better. A lot of that is being perpetuated through masculinity in some way, shape, or form. And so this dynamic of navigating the conversation in spaces where men are used to armoring up with their masculinity, putting that, I don't know, it was, I think, Lewis Howe's book, the Mask of Masculinity or something, but getting themselves in a place out in the world that you have to keep away from that conversation and protect yourself. And I can't talk about this until I'm 50 is something that actually makes sense when you think about how conversations are encouraged and how men specifically are welcomed to show up in spaces of vulnerable conversation. So
Right.
with that, I would love to hear a little bit about, we haven't named the uncomfortable conversation yet. I feel like we've been talking around it and about it.
Yep.
So I'd love to hear about, how the uncomfortable conversation came to be.
Yeah. So currently, I have two avenues of my work. So one is the Uncomfortable Conversation, which is essentially a nonprofit YouTube channel that imagines a world where we're all more comfortable having different kinds of conversations about and related to sexual violence. And so it's a little bit more of a cultural play. The other manifestation of this work and this mission in my life is around helping organizations tackle workplace sexual harassment. So, sort of thinking about how to think about sexual harassment prevention and response through a skills based lens. And so, that's both the training and consulting I do, as well as the book that I have coming out, Breaking the Silence Habit. But the uncomfortable conversation happened first. And the uncomfortable conversation happened. And so, this was before the Me Too movement. So after doing all of these conversations, what I wanted to do is I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to write a book for young men. I wanted to write a book about how to have conversations about sexual violence. I had been doing some blogging. I've been writing for Ask Men, writing about navigating consent, writing about how to support a survivor of sexual violence that you were in an intimate or a dating relationship with, bringing some more visibility around the idea of men who experience sexual abuse or assault directly. And so I went out there, I learned what you had to do in order to write a book. So it's like, I wasn't like, oh, I want to write a book. I thought to myself, I want to create a world where men are more capable and skilled up to support people in a more realistic and meaningful way. So therefore, I'm going to need to learn how to write a book.
Right.
And so I went out, I started doing all this blogging. I got a literary agent, we pitched it. And basically the publisher said, like, nobody wants to talk about this topic. It's like, who are you? You're not a psychologist. Like, you can't write this book. Like, nobody wants to talk about it. And
Oh,
so I said, okay. And then instead what I did is I went off and I did a TEDx talk, which basically was the
yes.
book in 15 minutes. And so I did this TEDx talk. And after the TEDx talk, I thought I was going to go around and do speaking engagements based off of the TEDx talk and try to get people to talk more about this. And what started happening was every room that I went into, whether it was middle schoolers or fraternity members or junior league members, that their questions were all the same. And it was like, and their questions were all very practical. Like, well, my friend told me they were sexually assaulted. And this is what I said. Was it right? What should I have said? What do I do in this situation? What do I do in that situation? And what they wanted is, like, they wanted me to answer the question in their voice.
Mm.
So it was like, it wasn't like, give me some ideas and some general bullet points and like a frame. Like, they liked the framework, but it was like, give me a way that I can see myself in this conversation as myself. And so I thought to myself, well, gosh, if I'm, even if I'm going in relatively big rooms of maybe, 100 people, it's going to take me a really long time to scale this idea.
And go one by one. What question do you have?
Right, exactly. Like, it was
Yeah.
just going to take a really long time. And so I got together with my best friend, Russ, who I had mentioned before, was my best guy friend, who just happens to do work in post-production in television in New York. So he actually knows how to make videos. And because the other thing that I was noticing is that that there were like all these YouTube content creators, and they would just get out there and like do content and just like do it in this really cool way. And they weren't afraid of getting it perfect or right. It was all about volume. And nobody had ever tried that on the issue of sexual violence. I was like, well, I'm going to try it. And originally, Russ and I thought we would be the people in front of the camera. That did not go well. Neither of us can act, and so that was a problem. And so we did put our like the original series on the channel eventually. But what we are good at is bringing people together and organizing video shoots. And we can write and we can write and we can pitch ideas and we can kind of bring people. And so what we ended up doing is in 2018, we produced 100 short videos that are up on the YouTube channel. We recruited professional actors. We wrote the scripts. Like we kind of did it all in this very shoestring budget because it was about volume of content. And so we have videos about how to support survivors, navigating consent. I've got about 10 videos on how to get drunk and not rape somebody because it's actually there's many different ways that you can do that are all really interesting and entertaining to watch. And then we started organizing these interactive screening events, which was also really fun. So, because if you ask somebody if they want to go to a sexual violence prevention workshop, people have other plans suddenly. But if you ask them if they want to go to an interactive screening event that's at HBO's offices in New York, wow, imagine that. People actually want to go to that because they think it's cool. So is this so like what I get really excited is like, how do you market conversations about sexual violence in a way that people will actually show up for? Because once you get them talking about it, they all really want to talk about it. So that's been really fun. The Uncomfortable Conversation, it's basically, the way to think about it is it's a nonprofit YouTube channel. It's content that's free and accessible for anyone. We don't do any education or training ourselves out of that. There's no professional staff for it. It's just basically Russ and I and some of our network that we will get around and organize about 4 video shoots a year. And I've been increasingly starting to do those with partners. And so one of the fun things that we did last year was I worked with a friend of mine who was working with a group of students at the Margarita Munoz Academy here in Boston. And we did an entirely 100% youth produced shoot. So they came up with the ideas, they wrote the scripts, they acted in them. I brought in a videographer and we did the editing. And so we had a series that was in both English and Spanish, which really was how these conversations are showing up in their hallways, in their homes. And the themes that came out of that, which I thought were so interesting, was, one is just the role of peer pressure and how peer pressure impacts the kinds of relationships that we have, as well as the desire to have these conversations with adults and adults being really uncomfortable about having them with their kids, and just the misinformation that some of these students were getting from the adults that they trusted in their life, and the desire that they had to have more realistic conversations with people about sexual violence.
Again, I was wowed by the college conversation. As you mentioned earlier, you were talking about how education around and conversations around this topic used to be, historically, were just to prevent you from becoming a rapist, right? From in the forum. And it was a fear scare based tactic of like, if you don't, you'll be a rapist, you'll be a bad guy. And there isn't that in between of, there are all these different ways that you're showing up in the world that you have a choice one way or another. And it's not as black and white as we might think.
No, it's not.
And as kids are so thirsty for understanding and hungry for understanding what the shades of gray are, and really understanding why something that they did made their parents clam up, or why they weren't allowed to do X, Y, and Z, and that made them bad, but they didn't understand and no one explained it. So how old were these kids?
They're high schoolers.
Wow. Oh.
It's amazing. And it's funny, right? Because you think about it, is that rape might be a rule or a definition, but consent is a language. And so the way that you teach a language or skill is really different than the way that you teach a rule. And when you think about it through that lens, it's, we had another group of young men that acted. We just filmed a bystander intervention series in New York. And so I'm really excited about the content that's going to be coming out soon with those. But we had a group of young 20-something actors. And what they said is what they're being taught in college now is that consent is simple. And what they're experiencing is that it's not simple at all.
Right.
They're taught consent is simple. Then they go and ask somebody if they can, touch their private areas. And they're like, oh, like, why are you asking me? Like, just do it. Right. And so it's like, it's so confusing. And so they're being told it's simple, but then it's like, in order to be a man, you're supposed to just do it, and
Right.
being shamed for asking, and then you're like, I don't know what to think about this. It's like, well,
Right.
now I'm going to just not talk about it anymore, because the whole conversation is really uncomfortable.
Right. I'm just going to opt out, or I'm
Yep.
going to keep stumbling and doing things wrong without having any idea
Yes.
why or how, because even after I do something wrong, we all clam up. So
Yes.
how do we
Yes.
navigate our mistakes?
Yes.
Wow.
Exactly.
Okay. So, listeners, there will be show notes so you can have access to those amazing videos. You can listen to them, you can watch them. I've watched a bunch of them. They're amazing. And one of the things that struck me that was so interesting, and again, like you talked about the marketer in you, right? That you just want to create the space for the conversation to happen, but you also want to build the awareness. And
Yep.
I just thought it was so clever. I guess I'll use the word brilliant because that's what came to my mind first. That in these, you're using humor and you're using
Oh, yeah.
humanity really to talk about stuff that has been seen as othering, distancing. Like if somebody were to do that, they are so far from a human being. They're dehumanized so far. So if I'm feeling human, I can't do that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how, especially as you mentioned, you're writing a lot of this stuff and you're facilitating these conversations and thinking of these conversations around consent as kind of an ever evolving language landscape. How you came to the space of, like you mentioned, you actually said earlier, like it's entertaining, which I think probably feels a little weird if you haven't watched the videos yet, but really they are. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you approach that.
The way that I approach is like both through the uncomfortable conversation as well as through the work that I do in workplaces, is like, I think all we want is to just show up and live in humanity with other people. And I think in a lot of cases we have a choice about whether we can live our lives through the lens of expecting the best of humanity or expecting the worst of humanity, because humans have the potential for amazingness and they have the potential for pure evil. And I want to live my life in the space. If I'm going to make an error in judgment, I would rather make an error in judgment assuming the best out of people and being disappointed than the other way around. And the thing that I've learned too is that the more that we can deepen those connections with each other as humans, and this is essentially what the research around bystander intervention says, is that it actually does start to prevent and take away the power of the people who are acting in evil. And so in order to do that, we have to embrace all of the different parts of ourselves. And sometimes that means crying, and sometimes that means laughing, and sometimes it means crying and laughing in the same sentence. And so it's
Right.
like, feelings are messy, humanity's messy, emotions are not permanent. It's like, and to be able to move through them, it requires us giving each other the space to do that. Something I've been reflecting on lately as well is that, when we talk about diversity, we kind of talk about diversity through a very intellectual lens of like diversity of
Yes.
like opinions and of thoughts. And one of the things that I've been really just contemplating and reflecting on recently is that people can have a diversity of emotion around the same actual idea. Like the idea may
Yes.
be a single idea, but people have lots of different feelings about that idea. And that it's like, that's actually the hard part of creating conversations about the kinds of things that we need to talk about. And you can, as an individual, have multiple feelings about the same topic
Mm-hmm.
too.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the discomfort, when we are feeling multiple things at the same time, when we're understanding multiple things to be true at the same time. Navigating complexity is really uncomfortable, but at the same time, it's the only way we're going to get through our lives and our relationships in a way that might remotely lead us to a world where we don't have to suffer in the same way that we suffer now.
Yeah. You can't see me. I'm like nodding. There's so much of this. There's kind of two things that came to my mind. And specifically when initially we were talking about how there really isn't the space for this conversation and we don't talk about it. And really, I mean, if we think prior to Me Too, and really if we think, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, like there was still conversation about sexual violence. It was just minimized. It was either
Mm-hmm.
like you would make the victim so small that and the villain so large as this big bad wolf kind of character that it became this caricature of itself, and it then became inaccessible for real life conversation
Yes.
about other humans. And then
Right.
there is this whole idea of locker room talk, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you're actually going to talk about it with your buddies, you're going to make jokes about someone's body, you're going to make jokes about this time where you did something and this girl felt this way or this guy felt this way, and like humor was the way to kind of shield yourself from the uncomfortable aspect of the fact that it didn't go
Mhm.
as planned. And so it's really interesting because a lot of times, as you were just saying, like as one person in one situation, I kind of don't like this, but I've been using it a lot lately. So it's kind of like this onion, right? That like there are so many emotions that are happening, and the ones that are on the outside have been the most accepted outwardly. And as you peel them back, you might feel really sad. You might feel really angry. You might feel really,
Right.
uncomfortably laughing, because some people do that when they're super uncomfortable. There's laughter and they're like, I don't even know why I'm doing that.
Right.
And just this idea that like there isn't one way to handle it, and there's also not one way to handle it within yourself.
Right. We lead with the emotion that we've been socially like that we've been expected to lead with. And so, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because you talk about how do you show up with empathy and grace and understanding for people who are doing what society is expecting of them. And so it's like, so when I think about it from, from a male perspective on the topic of sexual violence, how do you give people an opportunity to peel back that layer of the onion so that they can get to something more real, where like they're going to show up with anger and defensiveness. I'm not going to be mad at you for doing that, because like I the only thing I can be in charge of is my own reaction, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, and I think about some of the parallel issues too, as you're thinking about how particularly conversation like white women's tears, right? Of sort of like how white women show up in conversations about racism with their tears. And so it's like, yes, they show up with their tears, but it's like, guess what? You can actually continue to have a conversation through your
Mm-hmm.
crying
Right.
and understand that your tears are having an impact on other people and take responsibility for that. And it's the same with, I think it's the same with anger and defensiveness. And it depends on level, right? So it's like there's people who can cry and keep talking, and then there's people who cry and then need the conversation to be about their crying. And so
Right. It's like little kids that they use an emotion to get to an endpoint rather than experiencing the full emotion. And
right.
if we allow that emotion to continue to get to the endpoint, why would they stop? Right?
Right.
If a
Yeah.
kid cries and you give them what they want, the kid's going to cry to get what they want every time.
Right.
And you might have to bear through that discomfort that you don't want your kid to cry, or you don't want, the white woman tears example, I
Yeah.
think is a really, really important one, because the tears are coming from someplace.
Yeah.
And in the same way that that anger and that defensiveness and that fight that we were talking about in
Yep.
men is coming from someplace, when you're expressing any kind of emotion and the response outwardly is somebody just continually beating you up, it's really
Yep.
hard for you to move out of that place that you're used
Yes.
to somewhere else
Right.
if you don't feel safe enough to navigate that emotion and understand maybe this isn't the most effective for me to move towards a solution, but also, if this is what I'm doing because it's my reflex and I'm still getting punched in the face about this, I can't move anywhere else. I'm going
Right.
to try to protect myself as much as possible in that, and that will be my automatic go-to.
Yeah. And it's right. So it's a how do we shift the frame from a how do we have conversations, move through conversations in ways that are meaningful and productive? And what does that look like, and what skills do we need to do that? And so, so maybe for some people, moving through tears in a
Yeah.
conversation might be another. For somebody else, it might be stepping down off of an angry or defensive reaction. And so
Right.
honestly, it's like that's why like humor in both cases, humor helps. And,
Yes.
and like it helps people just sort of like get off their reaction. And in my book and in the uncomfortable conversation, kind of like one of the tenets of how to have an uncomfortable conversation is this idea of how you pause your reaction. So how do you pause your reaction and help other people pause their reaction so that you can decide how to move forward in a conversation versus being derailed by, it's like if you have a reaction and then somebody has a reaction to your reaction, and then the next thing you know, you're
Right.
not having a productive conversation
Right.
anymore. Like it's not possible.
It's like a game of telephone where the message started in
Yeah.
one place and it got through all this other stuff, and you're like,
Right.
wait, but how did it?
Right.
It
Yeah.
bounced off of all these things, and we're not
Yeah.
even talking about the same thing anymore because we got so distracted by
Yes.
the emotion that has triggered both the emotion that someone else is bringing triggers something in me, and my
Yes.
emotion is doing the same thing. Can you?
Exactly.
Okay, so I feel like I'm like, okay, tell me more about your book. I feel like you touched on the book a couple times, and I want to
Yes.
hear a little bit more in depth about the book itself. And one of the
Yeah.
one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I'm sure this will go wonderfully with the book, is how this time of Me Too.
Yes.
And really, I hate saying that because in the Me Too movement,
Yeah.
because I think it's so much bigger than a time, a place, a trend, a
Yes.
phase, any of that stuff that, again, allows us to put it in a tiny little box. It's a much
Right.
bigger societal and systemic issue that we need to address, name, and deal with.
Yes.
And so I'd
Yes.
love to hear a little bit about how this work you've been doing has shifted or I hope to say amplified since kind of Me Too has become part of the larger societal consciousness, and then how your book came about and what your book's about. So just a really short answer to that one, I'm sure.
Great. Yes, great. Well, I mean, so it's funny. So remember that the original reaction from publishers to the book pitch pre-Me Too was there's no market. There's no market for this conversation. So that is the part that the Me Too movement has effectively shifted that. And it's shifted it in more specific context, so in a workplace context. So what happened was I was doing the speaking, I launched the uncomfortable conversation. I was really happy with the way that was going. Throughout that year, the Me Too movement had broken, and I was watching it and interested in what that was doing. And so I started learning a little bit more about how workplaces. So I knew a bit about how schools, K through 12 schools, and college campuses were looking at this topic, and there had been some great progress there. So now there's an interest from workplaces in responding to Me Too, and I just kept getting angry at like the way that there would be some high-profile incident. Now we're basically, instead of having human resources play things out, we're having journalists play things out. That's like seemed like also not effective, personally. So, important plays an important role in terms of shining a spotlight on a particular issue and creating pressure. But like, it didn't seem like where we were going was an environment where people of all genders could go to work and do productive work together in a safe and respectful environment. Whereas like, that's the end game. That's the end game that I want. And so,
right. And you mentioned healing too, right? There's not healing that happens when it's a one-sided conversation of bombshell discovery after bombshell discovery. And, this, if you've heard me talk about this before, I'm sorry, but this idea of glorification and vilification, that like you can either be a hero or you can be a villain, and there's no room in between to be human and really heal from or understand where these things happen. Because when it's in print and it's blasted everywhere, and anytime you search your name on Google, that's your identity has become either this glorified, savior who then in 2 minutes might very well be a villain, or even just this idea of how we've turned. I'm getting it in my body. I know my emotions
now.
Yeah, the victim shaming, and how victim shaming has been something for years and years and years. Like, I very vividly remember in high school there was a girl that came forward and said she was raped, and she was on my soccer team. I knew this girl, and it was, again, unspoken victim shaming somehow. And how that all played out before Me Too and then post Me Too. I mean, you have someone standing in front of elected officials and being grilled and being shamed in front of the entire country and world on national television.
Yeah, well,
things have gotten just so amplified in a way that doesn't actually create space for healing and conversation.
C-SPAN is pretty much like the worst possible place to have a meaningful and productive conversation about any topic, let alone sexual violence. So it's, which is unfortunate, right? Because I think, because you're right, that's victim shaming. But another important and uncomfortable conversation is, to what extent ought somebody, how long does somebody need to be, how do you hold somebody accountable for their behavior in a way that doesn't perpetuate shame and dehumanization? And so that conversation was also totally missing from C-SPAN. Let's just say that. So
and it's from all the publications too, right? Shame begets shame begets shame begets shame, and it's kind of like, I want to get the biggest shame scoop here, and it's like, oh no, this is ugly.
No, it's just, that's not the world I want to live in. And so that's essentially, so what happened with the book is, so just pivoting back to the book, is thinking about how could I bring this conversation to workplaces, and particularly what I was learning about workplaces is that their primary response to Me Too was to double down on compliance, so to double down on the rules. And what I knew through my work and from my work around sexual violence prevention is that rules and skills are not the same. So you absolutely need to start with rules, because rules set expectations for what we need to know and how we need to behave, and that there is an expectation that we will hold people accountable. But if you don't simultaneously address the skills required to create safe and respectful cultures, the bad people are going to leave the conversation from the rules go back to a culture of silence and be empowered to continue doing what they're doing. So it's not just like rules, it's like rules are important, but they don't solve the skills problem, and they can actually create more problems if you're not simultaneously doing the skills. And so what I ended up doing was I spent a significant time with a mentor of mine, who ended up writing the foreword for the book, Len Schlesinger. He's at Harvard Business School. And what he gave me the crash course on was, how do you talk about the things that you talk about and care about in the language of business so that you can talk about this with businesses more? And then through that process, I ended up doing some connections with human resources offices and started doing basically piloted approach to training that was skills based, grounded in this idea of uncomfortable conversations, recognizing the fact that there's no 1 hour workshop that's going to magically cure your organization of sexual harassment. So like, let's not even pretend that that's a thing. And no, I love bystander intervention, but like a 1 hour bystander intervention workshop is not solving your problems. So what I'm trying to do through both the training and consulting work that I'm doing, as well as through the book, which is Breaking the Silence Habit, a practical guide to uncomfortable conversations in the Me Too workplace, is to go out there and really evangelize this message of skills-based sexual harassment prevention and response. And what that also does is that is a way to create workplaces that are inclusive of survivor experience as well. So it's not leaving that part behind, not leading with that part, because again, the Me Too movement has made people really pay attention to mostly the compliance piece. But what they're learning is that you go through and you do one of those online click-through compliance workshops, and people walk away afraid to have conversations. There's new research that's coming out from the Pew Center about how workplaces are increasingly volatile, and that both men and women are feeling uncomfortable knowing how to interact with people of other genders in the workplace. Like, and that's not the end game we want. The end game we want is people going to work in workplaces that are gender diverse, feeling safe and respected, and able to do productive work.
Yeah. And it's funny how when we separate these things, we separate them in a couple different ways, right? We're talking about kind of the gendered piece. We talked about age. So I called out like, oh my goodness, college. Oh my goodness, high school. And now we're like, oh, it's at work. And it's something that as you've said so many times through this, whether it was overt or through understanding through the lines, is like, this is a conversation that's not just in one stage of your life. It's a conversation that evolves and grows through all of your experiences. And then once you get to work, there is a rule and something that has some version of accountability. I say that I'm like squinting because I'm not really sure if that's the word I want to be using, but something that is written on paper about the conversations and the rules and the things that have been silenced for so long. And now you're supposed to learn how to follow those rules, understand what those words and those rules mean, because a lot of people, I think, in Me Too and in a lot of social justice work and a lot of this just awareness-based work is like these words that have very specific meaning get amplified so broadly, and then they get so diluted. So you don't know the difference between sexual assault, sexual harassment, becoming friends with a person of another gender, right? Like all those things become so cloudy. And so you just either don't care and you do whatever you want to do, or you don't participate at all. And everything becomes more and more stiff. So, I mean, the book, I'm like, can I have the book right now? The book, I'm sure does this in the skills-based work, but like, how do you think about, as you were structuring the book, how did you think about like tackling these issues outside of like what is maybe like an example of what it looks like from a skills-based perspective?
Yeah. So essentially, like in a nutshell, a skills-based perspective is you start with good compliance work. So compliance, from my perspective, is making sure that people understand the definitions. They understand your organization's policies, which may or may not be the same as what the law is. So you can, as an organization, have a different set of expectations about behavior as a condition of working in a particular organization. That's fair game. you need to understand that. And then the other piece that's really important during the compliance process is demystifying human resources. And so understanding what a reporting process looks like. So that's kind of step one is around compliance. Step two is assessing experience. Now, this is a really important one. I remember I went into a company and it was like the CEO was like, well, I don't understand like why we have to explain this stuff to people. And I said, great, well, let me survey your employees. And so
like, I do. Let me give you the data.
I was like, I do. I was like, but I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to show you. So
Yeah.
I was like, well, first I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to prove it. So, but it was what you find out is, and it was just going back to what you were saying, is that for some people, maybe they did talk about consent and healthy relationships and how to behave at work at the dinner table with their parents. For other people, maybe they didn't, and that was a completely taboo topic. Or maybe you taught bystander intervention workshops when you were in college. Like nobody's asking that question. So if what we're talking about is a skill, you wouldn't start teaching a language class without first assessing where people sort of like what people's level of fluency was. You wouldn't teach a math class like before you knew if people knew their numbers or didn't know their numbers and like who knows algebra and who does. Like it's like they're these building blocks. And so the first building block is simply the idea that we are going to talk about something in the workplace that is uncomfortable. I'm going to give you some guidance on how to do that. Then, so it's like, so it's one, compliance, two, assess people's experience, because what that does is it grounds people on the same page that there is a diversity in experience. And so maybe you shouldn't expect a single conversation or a single workshop to solve all your problems. And if you're somebody who's really experienced talking about this topic and getting all of the disclosures to you, like maybe you should be quiet and let other people learn something so that you don't always have to be the only person doing this. Right. And so it's like how to say that nicely. And then teach the uncomfortable conversation framework, and then develop realistic practice scenarios that help pull out skills like situational awareness and helpful intervention. So it's like, how do I recognize the impact of, so I'm at a sales dinner and I see somebody like putting their hand on somebody's back and there's 10 people around the table. One of the reasons that nobody says anything is that they're not thinking about what's the impact of that interaction on me, on my relationship with my manager, on my organization, on my colleagues, on the people on my team. So when we start to be able to see incidents like that or interactions like that as having an impact on a culture, not just on a person, where it's like, well, that sucks to be her. Like, well, she shouldn't be flirting with the person much. Or like, I don't want to get involved because I don't really know what's going on there. Like maybe she wants him to be doing that. And like, meanwhile, she's thinking like, gosh, nobody's like speaking up about this. And so it's,
and I don't want to lose this deal or something.
Right. Exactly. I don't want to lose the deal. And so it's like, so workshopping through a scenario. So it's like, you would take that and say, this is what happens. Like, how might the manager, somebody else sitting at the table respond? And it's like, and again, there's no right answer, but it's really helping people unpack, well, it might depend on their position of power. It might depend on their experience doing this. It might depend on them, knowing what to say or being afraid of saying the wrong thing or they might not want to offend the person. So what you do is you create opportunities to practice scenarios before they happen. Because the scenarios, honestly, like they all fall into some kind of category, right? Which is that you witness something that is troubling or potentially troubling and you don't do something about it. Somebody tells you that something happened to them and you have to decide how to respond. And so sometimes that's driven by compliance and sometimes that's driven by humanity. Usually it's driven by a combination of the two things. Or there's conversations around setting and respecting boundaries, which are two separate and distinct skills. So setting a boundary is a skill, respecting a boundary is a skill. People are at varying degrees of good or bad at those things, and there's no judgment around it. Just because you're bad at setting a boundary doesn't mean that somebody should be sexually harassing you or assaulting you. But at the same time, if we're all a little bit better at setting boundaries and respecting boundaries, we can notice when there's a boundary issue before somebody gets hurt. So creating conversations about boundaries, about behavior, and about healthy relationships, and then I usually will do a scenario or like a practice conversation around communication skills. So it's like I'm asking you to a group drinks thing, but you think I'm asking me out on a date, and now everybody's super awkward and like, but we still have to work together as a team. Like those are like scenarios worth practicing because they happen. Like people miss each other communication wise. So
yes, and there's a lot of assumptions that are made. There is that piece that again, when we've been in this space of silence, the conversation that you have historically is with yourself
Yeah.
inside your head.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
that is a very, very narrow set of blinders to operate from because you're not the only person in the conversation. You're not the
Right.
only person in the experience. So
Yes.
it is so important to be able to have, I use the word sandbox a lot. So I'm assuming when you're going into these places, look at me making assumptions after I just said that.
Mhm.
That it is creating a space for curiosity, for
Yes.
conversation in a way that is not saying, because I hear you saying, like, I'm giving you these scenarios, but these scenarios aren't necessarily going to play out exactly this way. The players in this scenario might not
Yes.
have the same lived experiences. So
Yes.
to one person, a hand on their lower back is like, whatever, don't worry about it. But that doesn't mean because of that one experience that the hand on the back for the next
Right.
person isn't a problem. Or doesn't
Yes.
it, and a problem doesn't need to mean that it's going to ruin their life for the next month. It might
Right.
just mean that it is something that is extremely uncomfortable and it has crossed a boundary.
Yes.
I love, and I just, I'm not sure if I'm projecting my own stuff, but I have the last like year and a half, boundaries have been like you know what? Now that I'm a year and a half in, my jam. I hated them
Yep.
up front, but boundaries, and I don't know, like in the social media sphere, there's a lot more talk about them. But can you just talk a little bit about, you mentioned bystander intervention and how
Hmm.
kind of boundaries play a little bit with that, of like, it's not happening to me. I'm witnessing something that's happened. Am I crossing a boundary by intervening in any way, shape,
Right.
or form?
Yeah. No, it's like that's another, I feel like that's also like a very American thing where it's like we're all taught to
Yes.
like mind our own business.
Mhm.
And like it's just that sort of individually, like it's like you've got that, everyone has that voice in their head, like I should just mind my own business. Like I'm not gonna, like I don't want to get involved. And I don't think you don't need to be all up in somebody else's business. But also an intervention does require some skill. It's the thing about intervention is that the earlier you learn how to intervene and that you learn some of the skills around intervening so that simply kind of interrupting an interaction
Mhm.
can often be helpful. So like bystander intervention doesn't mean going up to somebody and being like, "Hey, get your hand off her back."
Yeah.
Right?
Hands
It's like
off. Yeah.
right. It could be going up to the person afterwards, the person who you saw, the young woman at the table, and saying like, "Hey, I noticed a person had their hand on my back. Was that okay with you?" Like,
Right.
it's like, if it is, great. Like, it's like no judgment. Like, just wanted to check in. Or even saying like, "Would you want to switch seats with me?" Or if you were seeing something that you thought was really, if you knew ahead of time. So this is, again, goes back to the, how do you get people to break their habit of silence? So if
Mm.
you knew ahead of time that this was somebody who had been targeted repeatedly and is really frustrated with the way that male clients come on to her, especially when they're at dinner situations, ideally that would be a conversation that you would have had with your colleague ahead of time. So
Right.
then you have more information about whether or not the boundary is being violated or not being violated. And then it
Mhm.
gives you more information about how you can intervene effectively. If you didn't know that, you could also go to that person's friend and say, "Hey, that's your friend. It's like, I just wanted to keep an eye on that situation. Like, again, like, I don't know." And yes, it's uncomfortable. And somebody might be like, "Mind your own business." And my perspective would be like, great. If somebody says, then just go sit down again, but you didn't do the wrong thing by saying
Right.
that.
Right, right. And you, again, that friend, I think there's another piece of this, that I should mind my own business, but then I think there's this piece of, especially with the idea of how media coverage has been all about shame, of like this gossipy vibe, that if I
Yes.
talk about it, I'm making it this salacious thing and I might be making it bigger than it is. So maybe that's a reason I shouldn't bring their friend in, or maybe that's a reason that I shouldn't try, like, I don't want to create a problem when there wasn't one. But at the same
Right.
time, if you're coming, I mean, it sounds as though the way you said that, it's like I'm coming from a generous perspective. I don't know the end. I haven't made a
Yeah.
judgment on this. I'm just noticing what's going on.
Yep.
So,
Absolutely.
okay. So I have one last question that is something that comes up for me with a lot of the conversation around Me Too is, and it can be a very short answer, around like, how do you handle when people come to you with kind of the Mike Pence response to Me Too? Well,
Mhm.
I'm not gonna engage.
Oh, like, I'm not going to spend time with people of the other gender because I'm afraid I'm going to be,
Right. I can't
that's how I'm
control
going to.
myself.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I would argue that it depends on the person, right? So, and,
Right.
and interestingly, I hear similar things from women who say, well, I'm going to just go start a women only ride share. I'm going to go start a women's only co-working space so that like I don't have to like deal with you people and like deal with like your disgusting predatory behavior, right? So it's like so I would say this is a comment that I actually hear across gender. And usually what it is that it is coming out of a frustrated attempt to solve the wrong problem. So it's like, so it's great. If the problem that you're trying to solve is, so in some cases, maybe it's the problem of not being able to control yourself. In other cases, it's like, well, I am trying to solve the problem of not being falsely accused of sexual harassment. I'm like, okay, well, it's like that's there's some other ways that we might be able to solve that problem, and also like that's your solution is causing more problems for you and legally for your organization by perpetuating gender discrimination. But that's, again, talk to your lawyer about that. It's but it goes back ultimately, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And so the problem that we're trying to solve is, how do we get to a place where we can have healthy relationships, we can have healthy boundaries, we can solve conflict without freaking out and ending relationships, and we can be safe, respected, and productive at work. That's what we all want. So like, let's go back to solving that problem. Sitting in a room by yourself and only doing meetings with people of your own gender is not actually going to solve that problem.
Right.
So it's like, that's my response to that. And it's like, and also I'm like, well, I'm glad I'm doing this work.
Yeah. And you're like, read my book, please. We can handle all this, right? Exactly. And, I want to make sure that we give a plug of when people can expect the book. When is the book coming out? So I will include it in the show notes when it's up. But I know I'm excited to get a date on the calendar, get a season on the calendar in my mind where I can get amped about this.
The book will be available for sale on February 25th, 2020. Right. So there is an exact date for it. If you are interested in knowing when you can pre-order and being like the first to have it, you can go to my website, which is sarahbeaulieu.me, and sign up for my email list and be like the first to buy it. And then if you are, then I'll also ask you to like write an Amazon review and do all that sort of stuff. But because that such is the life of
gotta spread the word.
Yeah, and spread the word, right? And so you can
gotta hack the algorithm. Let's do this.
And I'm happy. I'm always happy to. I'm going to be doing a bunch of events and book signing and that sort of thing. And so what I always joke with people is like, buy a copy for yourself and buy a copy for somebody in your life who needs it. And I would be happy to sign it for both of you.
Yes. Okay. Cool. I'll be signing up. I'll be at one of these events, at least one of these events.
Buy it for your creepy boss.
Just keep it in your bag.
Exactly.
Well, I am beyond grateful for your time today. I feel like I could talk to you about so many other things. I'm going to go watch some more of the videos. February 25th is marked on my calendar. I am so excited. So if what you heard from Sarah today made you excited to have conversation with her, I will be including all of her information on the show notes. And if you need some help from a training perspective, if you need some guidance from a consulting perspective, reach out to her. She is amazing. Thank you, Sarah, for coming on today.
So great. I could talk again. My favorite topic, one of my favorite people.
Thank you so very much.
All right.
Bye. Okay, my friends, thank you so much for making it through this wonderful episode. I told you there was a lot of good stuff that we talked about and a lot that we can learn from this. And hopefully we can have more conversations that become less and less uncomfortable, more and more comfortable about these topics that have gone unspoken for so long. I mentioned this before, I'll mention it again. If after this episode you have something to say, you have questions, you have feedback, please do head on over to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast. Click on the Join the Conversation link and drop your thoughts in there. Submit the form and me and my team will get that wonderful information and your incredible insights. We really do appreciate having another end of this conversation with you as the listener. You are incredibly valuable and important to us. Also, if there are links and thoughts that you had that you're like, ooh, I didn't hear that, or I wish I knew where that was, we have an incredible show notes page for all of our episodes. If you head on over to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast again, yes, it is a page full of so many amazing things. You will see Sarah Beaulieu's face there. You click on that and there's her show notes page with all of the incredible links that go along with the wonderful things we just discussed. Okay, thank you so much for being so generous with your ears and your time and your energy again, and I will catch you on the next episode. Have a wonderful day.